Hi, and thank you very much for joining us for the Semperis webinar today. We're going to cover the best practices for upgrading Active Directory and how to mitigate the risks associated with your upgrades. Today on the line we have Mickey Bressman and David Lieberman from Semperis. The webinar presentation is being recorded, so if you want to review it later on or share with your colleagues who might be upgrading your Active Directory, we will be in touch with the webinar recording link. In addition, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them using the webinar question tool, and we will address all your technical issues and other issues online. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mickey to start today's presentation.
Thank you, Meital, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the Active Directory upgrades. For those of you in the East Coast, well, maybe others as well, I can only speak of what we have seen here. I hope you recovered from the blizzard earlier this week. We had quite a bit of snow here. On this presentation, we are going to discuss, first of all, why upgrade. Sounds obvious, but still I think it's important to communicate the reasons of why going through the risky process. I mean, let's face it, upgrading an Active Directory isn't a risky process. So why are we going to do that? This is something that I think that we need to communicate to the management, and this is something that we're going to discuss. Then we will discuss the concerns that may rise during the upgrade in terms of the direct and the indirect impact. And from my experience, actually, the indirect impact is more likely and more concerning. Then we will discuss the risk mitigations for the various stages of the upgrade, focusing on preparation stage, which would be the most of the things that we'll be discussing, and then going into the deployment. And of course, as we will be wrapping it up, we will be doing summaries and go over the conclusion. The presentation will feature a live demo, and we will go back and forth between our content and the lab environment. Now just some basic things. Free to ask any questions. I'll be happy to address them after the presentation. The session is being recorded, as Meital mentioned, so you don't need to worry about taking notes, and you can simply concentrate on the presentation itself. And now I'm going to start with doing something which is against all the recommendations that we are here to speak about. I will launch an Active Directory upgrade just like that. To do that, let me just quickly switch to the lab environment. So this is the lab environment, and as you can see, this is a multi-domain environment with 6 domains, while Semperis is the root domain in this environment. What we will do now is simply try to upgrade the domains in the environment by using the start-down users and computers, or well, in this case, I'm going to use the Active Directory domains and trust actually. I know that some of you might prefer to do it through a PowerShell, which is perfectly fine, but I want things to be more visual, so I'm going to do it by using the start-down console, the UI. Just before the presentation, I did 2 things to speed things up a bit. I have already raised the level of some of the domains here in the environment, so you will see that they are already after the raise to the standard 2008 level, and I simply left the Semperis domain to be the last one to be raised in this environment to 2008. So let's do it as we are talking. Great. Now that will start the application. We'll give it like a minute or 2. And another thing that I did just before the presentation, I also made sure that I have backups of the environment to make sure that I can actually recover the environment in case something goes sideways. Now that we have raised the functional level of the Semperis domain, let me also raise the functional level of the forest. So we're going to raise it to Windows 2008, and I know that many of you are upgrading from 2003 to 2008, so this is probably a scenario that you are familiar with. But of course, it's the same procedure if you want to upgrade to 2008 R2, 2012, and so on. Let's give it a minute or 2 just to replicate through the environment. All right, so assuming now, as you could see, I've just finished the upgrading process of my environment. That was very quick and easy. And now let's also probably, as you can see, and this is something I would like to show you, there is no way to go back. So I can only go higher. I cannot go back to the Windows 2003, which I used to be in. Now let's assume for a second that I've missed one of more of the critical applications during the testing stage, and all of a sudden I get a call that the application have just stopped and my manager is getting quite angry actually. But don't worry, remember that I took the backup before the upgrade, so we are good. Let's quickly kick off the recovery process. Let me switch to my recovery environment. Right, and I'm gonna log in to the environment, recovery environment here. Don't worry, I will explain everything in more details shortly. So my assumption right now is that I have a problem with my environment. It was not, as you've seen, due to the upgrade process itself, meaning the upgrade process actually went well, the AD has been upgraded. But I have a problem, and some of the applications, and they are very critical to my organization, have stopped working, and we will discuss in a second on what might cause something like that. And now my assumption is that I need to actually revert the entire forest back in time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to quickly have a look and see which backups do I have. Just pick one of them. I'm going to take the last one. I'm going to run a quick analyze of the environment just to make sure that I have all of the domains backed up. Let me quickly have a look here that we actually can cover everything. Yep, that looks good. I'm not planning to make for this presentation any changes in the recovery process, meaning I don't want to interfere. I'm not planning to not recover any one of the DCs in the environment or the domains. I'm simply going to start the recovery process. So we're going to let the recovery process run. And while it's running, by the way, we have a log here, so we'll be able to see exactly what's going on. So I've just kicked off a forest recovery process. And while it is running, and we will take it a while to start with the backup and recovery, and we will go later about what stages actually are happening here, let me go back and start the presentation. So here we are. So we have started the live demo, and we can actually now go ahead and start the presentation itself. So the first question we need to answer is the why. Why to upgrade? And although it might sound obvious, from my experience it is very important to communicate to management the reasons, as with any other project, the reasons of why are we doing this. The more aligned the organization to the project, the higher the chance we will get the required cooperation. And since Active Directory affects everyone in the organization, we will need help in many areas. For instance, in order to map all the application the organization is dependent upon. So, for instance, you want to know which applications do we have in the environment, which of them are mission critical, which of them are most critical for the organization. For all of that, you need cooperation. You might need some resources. All of those reasons are why you need to make sure that everybody are aligned with the project. Now, the reasons for the upgrade, well, they of course may vary between different organizations. The state of the current environment and so on. But some of the most common reasons, well, from my perspective, would be Windows 2003 end of life. This is quite obvious. There is no longer support by Microsoft, no security updates, and staying with this operational system is, simply put, dangerous because there is no support and no security updates. Don't think we need to add anything more to that. Now we need to distinguish the difference of upgrading the OS as opposed to upgrading the functional level of the forest, for instance. The reason for upgrading the forest level might be because you want to take advantage of the new functionalities. In 2000, if you're upgrading from 2003 to 2008, then that would be the recycle bin, among other things, but there is new functionality with every functional level raise. And then the same thing goes for the operational system. if you go from 2003 to 2008, well, first of all, you'll be supported, which is great. But by the way, Windows 2008 is also kind of reaching end of mainstream support. So you probably want to go 2012 and above. So that's the reasons of why. Just to summarize that, from one perspective you want to have the support for your environment. From the other perspective, you want to enjoy the new functionality that is provided with the new level. But the upgrade process is not simple. Well, it's not as simple as you've seen me just do it. And now let's discuss why. So what's the problem? The very basic problem with Active Directory upgrade is that we are modifying the Active Directory. And we all know that Active Directory is that piece in the infrastructure that just cannot tolerate downtime. In fact, Gartner referred to Active Directory as zero tolerance applications, meaning no possibility of downtime. And everything in the organization starts with an Active Directory, and not having it means the organization kind of stops. Now the second problem is that some of the upgrade actions, as we have just seen, are irreversible. So if something goes wrong, there is no simple way to recover. So on one hand, we have the most sensitive system in the organization, and then on the other, if something goes wrong, it can't simply be rolled back. There is no easy way to just recover from something like that. In terms of what are the things that I've seen in the past and what I'm hearing, so the most known concern in the community is the schema upgrade. Most of the admins I know have a schema upgrade process where they will stop the application on the schema master, perform the extension, do some kind of a sanity testing, open application to one DC, and then do some more testing on that DC, and then maybe open application to one more and do one additional test. But that's kind of what you will see with most of the organization. In reality, based on the data that I've seen from Microsoft, the number of schema extensions that actually went wrong is actually very small. So it might happen. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but as opposed to the number of critical applications that have stopped to function due to the changes, of course, to the AD environment, to the upgrade, the schema extension I think, is the less likely to happen. So from my personal experience, the problem usually will not be with the AD upgrade itself, meaning the upgrade itself will work in most of the environments clean, perfectly, and in a straightforward, meaning you will do the upgrade and everything will go well in the AD itself, and the problem you'll probably see will actually be with the applications that are around the AD, which is eventually what the organization cares about. So the upgrade includes, first of all, DC operational system upgrade. That can cause third-party application malfunction. I divide those into two. First of all, applications running on the DC itself, and applications that are relying on the DC for authentication and authorization activities. Just as an example, DAS encryption in Windows 2008 L2 DCs was disabled by default, and as far as I remember, applications that were trying to use DAS encryption for Kerberos, legacy Unix systems, for instance, they were failing when they hit the Windows 2000 L2 DCs. And just before that, when they used to work against the Windows 2003 DCs, everything was fine. So simply by changing the operational system, nothing more than that, you have just caused some of the application to stop working. That's an issue. So and what's interesting to mention here in terms of the Microsoft Active Directory, or in this case the operational system upgrade, everything went well, and we succeeded in what we were trying to achieve in terms of the upgrade of the system, but applications stopped working, which is not a very good place to be in. So what we will want to do, we will want to try and see how can we mitigate those risks from an AD upgrade. And the answer for that would be spending more time on the preparation stage. But just before we move to talk about the preparation, let's see how our recovery process is going. So I see that we are having some progress here. All right, so we are going ahead with the recovery, which is great. But let's back and continue with our presentation. Mitigation, which is basically the best thing that you can do, is test, 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 and test some more. Mitigation and preparation in general. The more you prepare, the less likely you to find yourself unprepared. I guess it's straightforward, cut understood, but don't worry. We will share this presentation. I know there's a lot of text in this slide, and sorry about that, but you will have it all, and the presentation will be shared, so you can definitely see it from there. And as I mentioned before, if you have any additional questions, just shoot me an email by the end of this presentation, and I'll be happy to provide additional information. I do, however, want to discuss the general plan and emphasize some of the points that sometimes are being ignored. So what I would like you to take from here is, first of all, I want you to see that, and I guess that's quite known, but the upgrade process, one of the things that I've just mentioned that, but one of the things that you need to remember that some of the steps here are reversible, and the best way to be prepared for an irreversible stage is actually to have a recovery solution in place. Let's go that way. It can be your own process, it can be a third-party solution, but you need to be ready for those just in case. And you need to do as much testing as possible when it comes to the organizational applications. So let's move ahead. So the first thing that I would like to mention is build a lab environment. And by saying build a lab environment, I definitely want to make sure that you understand that I'm not talking about creating what I refer to as a clean environment. Actually, I mean that you should build a lab environment that is as close to your actual production environment as possible. I think it's quite obvious, and I can assure you that if you will take a clean installation of Windows 2003 and upgrade it to Windows 2008, it will work. It has been done many times before, and this test will not really help you. So my recommendation would be to create an isolated environment, and when I say isolated, I mean isolated 100%. You must make sure that no matter what, the isolated DCs will never find the production ones, because that will cause a lot of trouble in your AD production environment. And if you cannot do that, and I'll discuss of how to create the lab environment in a second, but if for some reason you cannot take a copy of your production environment and isolate that in the lab environment, then I would recommend to try, and if you're starting it from clean, then just do as much installations in the environment, or at least the extension, that will get the environment as close as possible to the production environment. Now, of course, nothing would be just as the production environment, just as good, I mean, but the closest you can get to that would be the best thing to do. Now, in terms of creating the lab environment, I know that for large environments, this can be a bit of a pain, and that's due to the metadata cleanup. For example, things that I've seen in the past, if you have an environment with 300 DCs, and in the lab environment you're planning to keep 10 just to represent the different domains in your environment, you need to do some cleanup in that environment in terms of the DNS, in terms of the metadata cleanup. I'm sure that you guys are familiar with the process. And this might take a long time, and that can be also, well, it's not very sophisticated, but it just requires a lot of manual labor. So I would recommend, if you can, use some kind of a third-party solution that can simplify things for you, and in terms of creating the lab environment and doing some of the steps for you. So that would be a big recommendation. If you can create the lab environment, that's like the best thing to do. If in that lab environment, if you have the option to also introduce some of the critical applications that you have mapped before, and we will get to the map critical application in a second, But just for the lab environment, if you can introduce the same applications with the same patch level, with the same configuration in that lab environment, then you'll be able to actually do the tests that would be as close as possible to what you will experience in the production environment itself. Now, in terms of mapping the critical application, this one is a bit tricky. So beside having conversation with as many people as possible in the organization, and having conversation is something that you will definitely need to do a lot during the AD project upgrade. You need to have conversation with, well, quite a lot of people basically, because again, everybody is involved with AD in a way. I would advise you to spend some time going over the DC's logs. The tricky part though is that many of the legacy applications might find that certain processes runs only once a month or sometimes once a year. So it will not help you unless you're planning to look on the logs for a year, which I kind of doubt. So going on through the logs only, which is a great place to start because it will give you a lot of information in terms of what actually going on in the environment. But I would definitely recommend that you have conversations with as much people in the organization, the stockholders, as much as you can. You want to know if the organization, maybe the organization even have a previously prepared business continuity plan, and they have already mapped out all the critical applications. So you want to have as much information as possible in terms of what are the critical applications in my environment, what are the critical processes, and then, if possible, to see how do we test those against the new and upgraded environment, both the operational system to support the authentication and authorization processes, and both in terms of the new level of the Active Directory domain and the forest in my environment. And of course, again, make backups prior to reversible actions. So I would recommend, of course, not to do it as I did at the previous example where I just executed 2 irreversible actions at the same time. The recommendation would be, of course, to have a backup before every one of those irreversible actions, to back up your entire AD environment, do the change, give it a while, make sure that everything is still up and running. You don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to figure out which one of the changes have influenced the environment. So upgrade if you are in a multiple domain environment, upgrade one of those and then proceed to the next one. That would be the recommendation. So basically, backup every time before you're about to do the reversible actions. So let's see just what's going on in the environment, although I accidentally already kind of had a peek there. So I see that in terms of our restoration from backup, we are done with the restoration of from backup directly, and all of the domains are already actually restored. And what we are doing now is the metadata cleanup and the domain controller's demotion. So for those DCs that were not restored from backup, the system here will now do the DC promo stage. And then for DCs that at this stage I did not mark to recovery, that's where the metadata cleanup will actually kick in. Now let's move on. Now, how and what is the upgrade sequence? So prior to the upgrade, and this is like a general recommendation, but run a health test. You want to make sure that your environment is actually operational. This is a very important stage. I would also add here that a simple reboot, if possible, of some of the DCs in the environment, just to make sure that the last updates to the OS are implemented after the install and so on, and also just to make sure, and that's from previous experience that I had, that the DCs are actually coming up after a reboot. I had an experience with well, many years back with one of the customers when we started the DC and we just found out that somebody for some reason changed the drives at that DC, and the DC would just not go back up. Now if that's the only problem that you have, that's fine, and this is something you can deal with. But if this is now a scenario where you actually experiencing some kind of a disaster already, and now on top of that the DC will not come up, well, this is not something that you want to experience. So the general recommendation here, run a health test on your production environment, and there are plenty of tools from Microsoft that allows you to run the test of your AD environment. You can also upload the results to and have them analyzed by Microsoft on Azure. That depends on your organization, of course. And then make sure that your DCs are able to reboot, just as an example. Then the next step would be, well, the next and actually the first step would be to upgrade all the DCs that we want to have in our new environment to the new operational system. That doesn't mean that you need to immediately change the functional level of the domain or of the forest. It just means that you have the new operational system on the DCs. So for example, if we are coming from 2003 to 2008, that will mean that we have now the supported system in place, but it doesn't mean, for instance, that we have the functionality as the recovery bin, just as an example. Then at this stage, well, you can actually go ahead and start the raise of the domains, of course one by one, and eventually you can also do the raise of the forest level. And just as we've mentioned several times already before, you need to make sure that in case of something goes wrong with one of those changes, you can always go back to the previous point in time. So now, as soon as you've done with that, you can actually add the new features. And then the DFSR, sysvol, Active Directory Cycle Bin, and so on. Those are the things that you'll be able to start and enjoy in the environment. Now, the deployment should be done in stages. And I think that that kind of makes perfect sense by itself, but just to explain. You need to prepare the Active Directory database for the new DCs, which is called AD prep, and now it's a separate function by itself. You need to deploy the first domain controller with the new operational system and see how the applications are working with that domain controller and everything is still operational and nothing crashed till now. And then you can start to deploy additional domain controllers one by one, and then retiring the old ones, which will eventually get you to a point where you don't have any old operational systems in the environment, and you now have only the new domain controllers, and you have all your applications working against those DCs. So at this stage, you should be fine knowing that your applications can actually work with the new OS, and this is the first stage that you want to be done with, and you probably want to give it some time just to make sure that the processes are running and everything is in place. One of the things that you also would probably want to communicate to the management is that there is no point in doing a very quick migration or upgrade. In this case, this is not a migration, that's actually what I meant. It makes more sense to do it in stages, to give some time for the systems between the different stages. So I would not recommend doing it all as fast as possible, but just give it some time. How much time? Well, that's kind of depends on the organization and the processes and so on. But if possible, I would recommend maybe waiting something like a month. And then as soon as you're done with that stage, you can move ahead, upgrade the domain functional level per domain. Again, I would not recommend doing more than one domain at a time. But after you are done with all the forest functional level can be raised now, and this is basically when you are done with the upgrade process and you can start and implement new features. For that, also just a small word, you need to make sure that you understand what these new features will mean to you. So, for example, I don't know why I just keep going back to the the recovery bin, but if you set that the recovery bin, you should know that this is also an irreversible action. it will probably have some impact on your environment in terms of the size of the AD database growing a bit now. And you also need to make sure that you don't have any security issues that might interfere if you have any policies that do not allow you to have the recycle bin. This is something that you should consider. So all I'm saying here, the fact that you can now start and introduce the features is great, and you will probably enjoy them a lot, but it also requires you to do some thinking in terms of how do we want to enable those, at what point, and again here as well I would recommend to do some testing in a lab environment just to make sure that you're ready. Now, by the way, I forgot to mention, but usually, at least in the larger enterprises, before going from the lab environment that we have created for the AD upgrade process, and so between that and going to the production environment, if you have, and most of the larger enterprises have, I would say pre-production environment where you already run most of the applications, and this is kind of as close as possible to the production environment, but not really. You definitely should implement the upgrade in that environment as well and make sure that everything there is running as expected. Let's see where we are with our recovery process. So meanwhile, the metadata cleanup have finished. The domain controllers demotion have done. DNS cleanup and namespace resolution is done. And we seems to be, actually the Semperis functionality is also done, and we are in the last stages of re-promoting the remaining domain controllers. Yeah, so that's coming ahead nicely. Let's go back. Conclusion of the things that we have discussed till now. So upgrading Active Directory bear its own risks. So you need to be aware of those, and you want to be able to mitigate them as much as possible. The mitigation steps that we have discussed were around building a lab environment, doing as much test as possible, and by the way, some of the links in this presentation that I've added are pointing to the relevant Microsoft sites. There is a great PFE blog post that actually goes through the different stages if you want to zoom in much more into what are the stages and how the recovery process should look like. So this is something that you should probably go ahead and take a look, and well, this is highly recommended actually. And you also want to make sure that you have a way to recover your environment in case something goes wrong, and especially if this is one of those irreversible steps that needs to be redone from scratch. And that's kind of, if I can just recommend for you to have two things to take away, you know what, let's have three. One, communication. Have as much communication as possible with the management teams and with the application guys to make sure that everybody are aligned and everybody understands what's going to happen. The second would be create a lab environment, go through all the changes in that lab environment. If possible, have a lab environment to be a copy of your actual production environment, so you'll be able to compare everything there. And then, if possible, go through a pre-production environment to make sure that you do as much test as possible. And then have a solid, tested, and I think tested is the most important thing here, Active Directory disaster recovery plan that you will know that no matter what, you can still recover. So those are the main three recommendations, and let's see where we are with the recovery process. So I'm seeing that we are almost done. Yeah. So if you have any questions in terms of what you've seen in this presentation, and if you want to reach out and I don't know, anything that you would want, you're welcome to send emails either to me or to the support team at Semperis, and we will make sure to get back to you. Now let me see if we are done with the recovery. And I see that actually it looks like, yeah, we are done. So full force application is done. Let's see if we have any errors here. No, it's actually all done and all good. So now what we can try and do, we can actually try and log in back to the environment. And let's see if that will work for us. So let me see if we can actually demo. So back to our environment, just where we left it. Of course, the DC is after a reboot, so it takes a second or two to allows us to see what's going on here. This is a lab environment, of course, and it seems to be up and running. Now let's run the you know what, we can even open the DSA. That's not really important which one of them. Come on, let me type. Okay, and let's try and do raised functional level of the domain. And voila, our current domain functional level is Windows 2003 as it used to be, and we can raise the level of the domain to 2008, which what we kind of wanted to show here. So just to wrap things up, as you can see, we have reverted the situation back just to the stage before our users were getting angry at us. And we can also now see that, well, just as I mentioned before, the domain functional level is 2003 and it's back to the operational stage, and hopefully our applications are back and running and everybody are happy again. So thank you everybody for taking the time, and thank you.